Andres Iniesta, Xavi Hernandez, Sergio Busquets, a midfield trio not only revered in Barcelona but the world over. Together, for their unprecedented success and the unique way they achieved it, they created a dynasty. That dynasty has long since fallen, but its influence remains. Sergio Busquets, though his powers have waned, still patrols that Barcelona midfield. And Xavi, in many ways the conductor of that great team, is the man charged with overseeing the new era of Barcelona. And it hasn't been easy. Xavi has inherited a squad of many unknowns, from the reliability of the old generation to the inexperience of the new one, and the gaping hole in between. Achieving the consistency, quality, and most importantly balance of that famous midfield has proved a difficult puzzle to solve. Like a Rubik's Cube, you move one piece and realise you've moved several other pieces with it. But perhaps that puzzle has now been solved. In Barcelona's two most recent big games against Atletico and Real Madrid, we got a glimpse of a new formula. One that has gotten Barcelona fans quite excited. One that feels right, feels balanced, and packed with quality. So have we just seen the blueprint for the next era of Barcelona? The foundations of a new dynasty? Or in answering one question, have we just opened up many more? Today, using everything we know about Xavi's Barcelona, we're going to break down exactly what that blueprint looks like, the in-depth mechanics of it, and whether this really is the foundation of another world-beating team. Xavi Hernandez, as expected, has come into this job with very clear footballing ideas. He is a proponent of positional play, and you can see that very clearly in the structure of his team. Right from his first game in charge, you can see the kind of zone occupation that has been prevalent in teams of Xavi's biggest influence, Pep Guardiola, for years now. A front line of 5 occupying all of the vertical zones, the central channel, the 2 half spaces, and the 2 wings. Behind that front line, you have your defensive structure, or rest defense. The remaining 5 outfield players arranged in either a 2-3 shape, like here, or a 3-2 shape, depending on the opposition. This is a very simplified explanation, but it's good enough for now. This system in itself leaves the idea of a midfielder up for interpretation. Who are the midfielders in a 3-2-5 formation? Well, rather than talking about traditional positions like midfielders and attackers, it's better we talk about the roles that players are actually performing on the pitch. And 4 roles in particular are of interest to us today, the ones that really define this team and the direction that it's taking. These 4. They are of utmost importance, and we're going to spend a while dissecting them. In this 3-2-5 shape, these 4 positions are very distinct and form this box shape, which is why you might have heard it referred to as a box midfield. But even in the 2-3-5, virtually identical roles still exist, and that's down to the dynamics of this Barcelona squad. So typically you'll have one wide forward on the right, let's say Ousmane Dembele, but on the left the width is very often provided by a fullback, so Jordi Alba or Alejandro Balde. Therefore the left forward comes inside, the original interior drops back, and you retain very similar roles regardless of the system. Just instead of a perfect square, it's more of a rhombus. Anyway, before we start defining these roles, there's one more bit of housekeeping to do, and that's to recognise the difference between Barca's left and right side. We've already mentioned some of the rotation, which creates a bias towards the left-hand side during build-up, where you've got a natural ball player dropping into this deeper position rather than a fullback. But that left-side bias is exaggerated even further by the role of the centre-forward, who in build-up generally drifts towards the left. This tends to create numerical advantages on that side, which often don't exist on the right. There is reason behind this, as we've spoken about many times on this channel. Barca do a lot of build-up and combination on the left, attracting opponents to that side, only to switch the ball out to the right where the winger can do damage in space. So that's something to keep in mind. Alright, that's enough of the background tactics. Let's get into the details and define each of these 4 roles, starting with perhaps the most well-defined, the pivot. But wait, just before we move on, I think this is a good time to give a shout out to the video sponsor. If you want to stay up to date with the latest news from Barcelona or any club in world football, the OneFootball app is exactly what you need. Follow the latest transfer sagas, upcoming fixtures, results, match stats, pretty much everything you could ever want about the clubs you care about directly in your notifications. That includes match highlights, even original OneFootball content. Plus, you can watch live games from international and worldwide competitions depending on your location. So you can go ahead and download the OneFootball app for free using the first link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen. And thanks as always to OneFootball for continuing to support the channel. The pivot is generally the deepest and most central of your midfielders in possession, and therefore at the heart of your build-up. They're offering passing options to your centre-backs and full-backs, but they're not necessarily going looking for the ball. In a positional play system, the pivot has to be very, well, positionally disciplined. They should remain in the central zone where they can connect with their interiors via third-man passes. Then in possession, it's all about keeping things neat and tidy. More often than not, that means making the simple pass with as few touches as possible. It's okay to go backwards, just don't get caught in possession. When there's no obvious pass on, you need a pivot who's smart and composed enough to find ways out. And while it obviously helps to have the vision to execute more expansive passes, security in possession is the main objective. They don't necessarily need to be making line-breaking passes, and they're certainly not becoming a goal threat very often, but you want to rely on them to keep the ball. That means they have to be very comfortable under pressure, receiving with their backs to goal, and making the right decisions in terms of body position, ball reception, first touch, and so on. Because of all this and the nature of Barca's patient build-up game, the pivot is getting a lot of touches on the ball. For example, in that recent game against Real Madrid, the pivot, Sergio Busquets, had more touches than anyone else. And against Atletico Madrid, who were aggressively pressing for most of the game, it was Barca's defenders who had the most touches, but Busquets was next on the list. Simply put, this is a very cerebral and disciplined role on the ball, and it gets even more demanding off it. I actually thought about calling this position the destroyer rather than the pivot, and although that would have been a bit of an exaggeration, it reinforces the importance of a presence in the middle of the pitch capable of consistently breaking up play. Primarily, that means positional discipline and reading of the game. As part of that rest defense, you need to be positioned correctly when there's a turnover, and obviously you need to be a good enough ball winner to not get beaten in central areas. And also, because it's Xavi's Barca, it's very likely you'll have a lot of pressing to do. So an athletic profile who can cover ground in transition, and ideal. All of this is starting to sound a bit unreasonable. A highly athletic ball winner who is also completely comfortable in possession, is press resistant, positionally disciplined, with an above average passing range. Yeah, that's why Sergio Busquets has been such a monumental figure for a decade and a half. However, looking forward, the burden of this role is being gradually alleviated by the second one that we're about to talk about. In a world where pressing has become more intense and coordinated, possession-based teams are frequently shifting to a double pivot in build-up to give a helping hand to their pivot who would otherwise be isolated. This second role, which I'm calling the controller, very much works in tandem with the pivot, both offensively and defensively. They're side by side in build-up, and they're also the core of your defensive structure off the ball. The main difference between these two roles is the balance between offensive and defensive responsibility. While the pivot is mainly there to keep things ticking and be your primary ball winner, the controller is likely to be a bit more adventurous and progressive at the cost of defensive prowess. So they'll be doing a lot of switches from left to right, the occasional line-breaking pass into a forward, or even a carry into the final third. I've called this role the controller because they're very often in charge of controlling the tempo and rhythm. They'll be very reliable technically, difficult to dispossess, but then able to up the tempo with a penetrative pass into the final third. Xavi himself was the epitome of this in his playing days. It requires a mature head, exceptional technique, and a hugely versatile skill set. For Barcelona, it's natural that the controller plays on the left-hand side, where much of the combination play happens. It also suits right-footed players, of which Barca have exclusively, because they can open up their body out and access the entire pitch. Despite a higher degree of freedom and versatility than the pivot, the controller is still stationed behind that front line. So it's a role that requires a high level of positional awareness and athleticism, both as part of the rest defense and during the press as they may get isolated. So that's our controller, key to dominating possession, dictating the tempo of the game, with a big responsibility on progression into the final third. So with that, let's move further up the pitch. These two positions ahead of the ball start to take on a lot more offensive responsibility. They're less involved in progressing through the thirds, and more in breaching the last line of defence. Whether that's through running in behind, receiving between the lines in order to turn and play the killer pass, or getting on the end of crosses, we're looking for direct chance creation here, goals, assists, and key passes. That's why, for the bulk of Xavi's tenure, the player operating in this left half space has been a traditional forward and not a midfielder, whether that's Ferran Torres, Ansu Fati, or Memphis Depay. I've called this role the inside forward for exactly that reason. But using a midfielder here instead of a forward, so Xavi or Pedri, is starting to become more common. The key thing to understand about this role is that it's largely about movement. How can you use movement to create opportunities for others, or exploit the space that others have made for you? That's why you'll constantly see the inside forward making runs in behind, in an attempt to create or exploit space. Another reason movement is so important is that your time on the ball here is limited. You're in such a threatening position for your opponent, often you'll be man-marked, and even if you do drop a bit deeper, they're going to follow you. However, the benefit of being on the left means you're more likely to profit from those overloads we talked about. Here Lewandowski comes across into that left half space, allowing our inside forward to receive on the turn. That's why there's 3 main ball playing attributes for this role. 1, you have to be exceptional in tight spaces. 2, you have to be very good at receiving on the turn. And 3, you have to be decisive and clinical with your decision making. And that includes in front of goal. The most common situations for an inside forward to be on the ball is either between the lines or receiving a through ball into the left half space. That's where we're looking for a decisive creator who can come up with a killer pass. Just as important though is being present in the box when the ball is on the right. That's going to happen all the time as the ball is switched out to the winger, and you need to become a goal threat. Remember, we're looking for goal contributions here. Defensively, like every position in this system, the name of the game is intensity. Positionally, the inside forward returns to that left side off the ball, whether that's in the first wave of pressure or against stronger opposition on the left side of a 4-4-2 mid-block, which means in those games they'll be integral to the defensive structure. And that gives us our inside forward, a dynamic mover who's great in tight spaces, comfortable on the turn, and has a killer instinct when it comes to chance creation and finishing. And that leaves us our final role, one that I've left until last very much on purpose. Yes, the right interior. Definitely a less flashy name than the others so far, and that's for good reason. I'd say this is the role that has remained the most undefined despite the evolution of this team. Is it a midfield role? Is it a forward role? It's sort of caught between the two, and that's heavily related to the left-right balance of the team that we've been speaking about. I'm about to show you 2 images of Barca's first phase of build-up. They're from the same game, and they're only seconds apart. In the first, which you're looking at, Barca have the ball on the left. They're in the 2-3-5 shape, and you can see the centre forward, Lewandowski, has come across to create an overload. That makes it a 4 versus 4 on the flank, and as soon as one of these midfielders steps up to apply pressure, Barca can use the movement and rotation we often see to create space for one of these players. Just an example would be the winger making a run down the line, attracting the fullback, so that Lewandowski can drop in and receive in space. Then maybe play a third man pass to the interior. This is pretty typical of Barca's build-up. Now though, let's shift to the other side. No centre forward making an overload means Barca are outnumbered, 4 versus 3. It's much harder to generate a free man here, because the centre backs can be much more aggressive with their pressing. If the winger makes a similar run, there's nobody in the space to take advantage. If the right interior takes up that space, they can be aggressively pressed by either the midfielder or even the centre back, because there's nobody else to worry about. That's why in the first phase, when the right back has the ball, this role very much becomes about ball retention, receiving under pressure and finding a way out to shift possession back over to the left, which doesn't sound like too much fun. But actually the left-right balance is a gift and a curse, because further up the pitch, as combinations are happening on the left, this right interior all of a sudden has the freedom to become an extra man, drifting across to create an element of unpredictability. We saw Pedri do this a lot in the game against Real Madrid, but even if they stay out on the right, they're going to benefit from the additional spaces that the left side overloads have created. This all makes this role pretty difficult to master positionally. You're making very intuitive decisions on whether to drift across or hold your position on the right. And on top of that, you're the main supportive player for your winger, and it's not always easy to figure out what space to occupy. Should you be giving an option in behind, or dropping back into a pocket? I suppose, unlike the inside forward, who is often reacting to what others are doing around them, the right interior is a bit more isolated and therefore autonomous, making it pretty difficult to play, and a part of the reason that nobody has yet made it their own. There's one other distinctive difference between the right interior and the left, which I think contributes to that, and that's the sheer fact that you are on the right side of the pitch. For right-footed players, when the winger has the ball, it's less natural to receive and turn towards goal onto your left foot, which would be important if you're picking it up and wanting to make decisive passes into the box. And that's why particularly Xavi tends to make those runs down the line rather than try to receive and turn in the pocket, which is generally more valuable. because just like the inside forward, this role should really be about creating threat from that right half space, not just making sacrificial dummy runs. All in all, along with the midfield-like responsibilities and build-up, this is a very demanding job for, ideally, a very versatile player. And there we have it, our 4 roles: the pivot, the controller, the inside forward, and the right interior. We've got a good idea of what each of them are doing, but the important part, if this really is going to be the foundation of a dynasty, is that we need to find balance. They need to work in sync. And while I've divided them very neatly, the reality of football isn't so neat and logical. One of the most important elements in a positional play system is movement. We've talked about it a lot already, and if you've watched my previous videos, you'll know where this is going. Johan Cruyff, who was essentially the pioneer of this footballing philosophy, put it like this: in possession, 11 men have to be in motion, busy fine-tuning distances. It's not a question of how much you run, but where you run to. Constantly creating triangles means that the ball circulation isn't interrupted. That means you're never just playing one role. In fact, you might have realized that even in clips from the same game, I've identified individuals playing multiple roles. So finding balance here isn't just about putting players in positions that suit them, but ensuring that it all still works when those positions start moving around. And with all this in mind, we can finally look at the players themselves and how that balance just might have been found. Let's look at 2 versions of this team: the version that was prevalent for a while, and the new version that fans are getting so excited about. This is version 1. Pedri is the controller, Busquets the pivot, Ferran or Ansu the inside forward, and Xavi, De Jong and Kessie sharing minutes as the right interior. And I completely understand the logic behind this setup, because it really prioritizes Pedri as the controller. When you look at the role and you look at Pedri's skill set, it seems a natural fit. He's an insanely well-rounded profile, reliable on the ball, he's a great progressive passer, a great dribbler, but what the stats can't tell you is his maturity and game sense that allows him to slow down and speed up the game as necessary. Really incredible despite his age, and you can understand why Xavi wanted Pedri in this role at the very heart of the team. The problem with this setup though was twofold. One, Pedri was seeing a lot of the ball, yes, but often too far away from the box, not making use of his incredible potential in terms of goal contributions. Numbers wise, he's already an elite midfielder in terms of goals and expected assists. The second problem was the right interior role, because while Xavi and De Jong are capable, they'll definitely give you all the running, the dynamism that you want, neither felt especially comfortable isolated on that side. De Jong particularly feels out of place here, miles away from the build-up, making sacrificial runs for the sake of the winger. That's why, alongside Busquets' decline, there was a clamour to get Frankie in the pivot role. At least then he'd see more of the ball, right? You can even look at his defensive metrics compared to Busquets, and they don't look that bad. The potential issues here though are tackling frequency and recoveries. And sure, you could put that down to the role that he's been playing, but when you watch him, he definitely is more passive defensively. He doesn't naturally smell danger like Busquets does. But for me, the bigger issue is that by playing Frankie as the pivot, you're limiting him so much positionally. He's a player that can give you complete control of a football game, but you need to let him intuit his way through it, rather than tying him down to what is definitely the most rigid role in this midfield. And so after lots of different combinations, experimentation, and losses in big games, Xavi has stumbled upon this. Busquets is still the only pivot, but De Jong is now our controller, Xavi the inside forward, and Pedri over as the right interior. In effect, what we've done here is shift the priority away from building around Pedri to building around De Jong. And that's important, because for me, undoubtedly, this is the absolute best use of the Dutch midfielder. He's on the ball a lot, he's finding ways out of the press, he's progressing the ball forward, and most importantly, he's got the freedom to roam and rotate with those around him. This is where playing Xavi or Pedri ahead of him, rather than a natural forward, comes into play. If you watch back that game against Real Madrid, you'll notice that pretty often Xavi is not a forward at all. He's dropping into deeper areas where he won't be pressured as much, and Frankie gets to live his dream of roaming forward between the lines, where to be fair, he has a great instinct for finding space. A natural forward like Ferran or Ansu would be less inclined to drop like Xavi is doing here. Speaking of Xavi, he really ticks a lot of the boxes for that inside forward role. His close control is ridiculous, he's great on the turn and very effective receiving between the lines. Add to that the fact that he's a very dynamic and willing runner in behind, and far more comfortable turning onto his right foot from the left-hand side, you have a role that suits him pretty nicely. That all leaves Pedri as the right interior, kind of the role that nobody wanted. But in my opinion, he plays this role far more optimally than anyone else. Because he's so smart and he reads the game so effectively, he has much less problem with the positional aspect of this role, the general isolation and lack of rotation around him. He knows when to present himself as a passing option, when to make a run in behind, or even when to just stop, giving his winger more space for a 1v1. He's also much more comfortable on his left foot than the others, giving him more options to be decisive when receiving a pass from the touchline. So all in all, this combination feels like it solves all of the problems. It gets players where they want to be, it allows for a lot of fluidity and control, so maybe this is it, the midfield that will lay the foundation for Barca's next dynasty. Well, there's still some problems, and I'm going to leave you with one big one that still plagues this setup, and will continue to do so until it is addressed. There are a few minor issues with the setup that perhaps you've thought about already. For example, Pedri, do you really want to relegate your most talented, consistent player from his most natural role as a midfield controller? Or Xavi, as a forward, can you really rely on this babyface to get 15 plus goal contributions a season? And both of those issues I'd love to hear your opinions on in the comments. But the bigger problem, the elephant in the room, is that this obviously can't be the future of Barcelona's midfield because of this man, Sergio Busquets. Physically and technically he's in decline, he's very possibly leaving at the end of this season, and that leaves a gaping hole in this squad. One that completely destabilizes the nice balance we've created here. I think it's reasonable to discount Frenkie de Jong as the solution. Based on everything I've said so far, to get the most out of Frenkie, to give him the positional freedom that he demands, you want a dedicated ball winner next to him, a more disciplined stay-at-home pivot. There have obviously been a number of names thrown around. Martin Zubimendi has been talked about a lot. Recently I've seen Marcelo Brozovic in the mix, and even Dani Parejo. You've also got Nico Gonzalez, who everyone has forgotten about. To discuss these options in depth, I'd obviously have to make a specific video, but one thing it's important to consider is that it's going to be very, very difficult to find someone who can do everything Busquets could do. Which is why, if I had to prioritize some of these traits, I'd definitely put the defensive and physical traits at the top of the list. You can probably get away with more of a destroyer archetype, incredible positionally, athletic enough to cover ground, and strong in ground and aerial duels. With De Jong alongside you, with Pedri dropping back to support, I think there's less need for an expansive, progressive passer. If we are talking traits in possession though, top of my list is security on the ball. Calm under pressure, economical, and knows their way out of a press. All of this makes me think of Nico, just because he is such an excellent physical presence and is smart positionally. One of his biggest issues was identifying progressive passes, but like I said, this system alleviates the need for that a little bit. So while we're not at our end game yet, this latest version of Barcelona feels like a huge step in the right direction. The basic structure from Xavi is always going to be there, but as players make these roles their own, they're going to start to evolve. They'll interpret them in new ways, form connections with those around them, and develop a way of playing that maximizes their ability. After all, if it can work against your greatest rivals, and emphatically so, you might just have something special on your hands. Thanks for watching everyone, I hope you enjoyed this extended video. I wanted to be as comprehensive as possible, and I hope you found it informative. If you did, consider leaving a like on the video, and subscribe if you're interested in football tactics. I've got plenty more coming up, Barcelona and non-Barcelona related. So thanks again for staying to the end if you have, and I hope to see you very soon. Take care.